So my name's Parker Agelasto. I'm the Executive Director for the Capital Region Land Conservancy. And just a little bit about us and the 2022 Conservation Games. Essentially, Capital Region Land Conservancy was formed in our region, in the greater Richmond area, encompassing 8 localities, at a time when there was no other land trust serving our community. And we came in to make sure that there was education on the ground, that we were helping landowners who wanted to voluntarily protect their working farms, their working forest. But also in 2009, after only being a few years old, we became one of the co-holders of the James River Park system. And since that time, we have had a great partnership with many of our local governments to help to establish future parkland, and including over 2,000 acres of public access lands in the greater Richmond region. Our mission is to conserve and protect the natural and historic land and water resources of Virginia's capital region for the benefit of current and future generations. And I think it's very important that we recognize that interconnection between land and water. But since we were founded in 2005, we have protected over 13,000 acres. That is land that we have protected under easements we hold, but also easements that we have facilitated with landowners and other easement holders. For example, the Virginia Outdoors Foundation or the Department of Forestry as examples. We have continued to expand our work, and in 2018, you probably saw that we did our first land acquisition with Malvern Hill, and we continued to help accelerate the pace of land conservation in our region by helping to acquire land, including land down on the James River at Dock Street, land in the Newmarket Heights battlefield, and most recently, land at the fall line of the Appomattox River. And it'll become more apparent to you when we get into this presentation how working on land and conservation around our waterways is critical, not just for today, but what we are anticipating in the future. So Peter, if you could give me the next slide. I'm going to hand it back to Peter so that he can explain a little bit more about the games and how you earn your points.
Thanks, Parker. So the conservation games were created 2 years ago as a way to engage all of our supporters in helping us do our work year round. And so this event is sort of a big Kickstarter for that. Whether you're interested in just learning through a webinar format, or getting out there and volunteering, or donating your time or money to the cause, the Conservation Games is for you. There are a lot of ways to earn points. If you've registered for this webinar, you've already earned 10 points for your team. And by attending this webinar, you can earn 75 points for your team. We only have 2 more events left in the Conservation Games this year, but we have more events coming up this winter and in the spring. So stay tuned for those. In the meantime, I just want to give you a little bit of an update on how the Conservation Games are going. Team Forest is in the lead. They took an early lead and they've kept it this year. Sometimes we have a lot of back and forth with one team taking the lead and then the next coming up a couple days later. But it's been a steady climb for Team Forest. Team Fields and Team Streams are always pushing forward. And with this webinar tonight, maybe Team Streams will make up that gap. Maybe some donations will roll in later this week. It's still anyone's game. But since this is the Team Streams webinar, I just wanted to introduce Team Streams briefly. Our staff leads for the for Team Streams are Megan Nolde and Ashley Moulton. And our co-captains for Team Streams are John Zugner and Sam Emsweiler, our partners at Friends of Bryan Park. And there are a bunch of events that they've been having going on in support of Team Streams throughout the games. But maybe we can say it better with a very short video about Team Streams. You'll see on the bottom right corner of the video, there is a volume icon. Just make sure that that is on. If you're not hearing audio, maybe you need to switch it on or off. But I'm just going to press play, and I hope you enjoy. We did one of those videos for each of our teams. I forgot that that was my voiceover. I wasn't expecting that, but I want to thank my coworker, Megan Nolde, who put together that video for us. And I'm going to pass it off to Parker real quick to introduce our guest speaker for tonight.
So it's a huge honor for me to introduce a friend and a colleague, Mary-Carson Stiff from Wetlands Watch. She is the policy director there, and maybe in the near future we'll see her in another role. But Mary-Carson and I connected, I guess it's now been 3 or 4 years ago, when Wetlands Watch started an initiative to better understand how to protect lands as there would be this sea level rise and the migration of our marshes. And they were looking at people from around Virginia and frankly around the country now to help advise on how to draft conservation easements that actually have a rolling effect. So I got involved and have really admired the work that Wetlands Watch does and can say that it's a second generation for me because my mom always enjoyed getting Skip Stiles, their executive director, to many programs, and he's a known entity throughout Virginia. But I will say for Mary-Carson, she and I also share the same alum college. So we're alums of Bates College up in Maine, both native of Virginia. We went way yonder up into the cold lands of Maine and found our way back to Virginia, both working in the environmental field. So it's a nice way to see somebody here working on that. And also I will share that she is on the board of the Virginia Land Conservation Foundation, which is a fantastic resource for funding of land conservation efforts throughout Virginia that is administered through the Department of Conservation and Recreation. And so it's a great honor to have MC with us. I will say she's not here in Richmond. She's down in Tidewater, where they face a lot more of these issues on a daily basis. And she's got her young girls. And I heard Skip say the other day on the news, it used to be that they closed schools for snow days. Well, last week they closed schools for flood days. That's how big this issue is. So we're really, really honored to have Mary-Carson Stiff join us today and look forward to hearing her presentation, and we'll have some interactive activities after so that people can see the impact. So MC, if you'd like to share your screen.
Okie dokie. All right, can everybody hear me? Okay, cool. I am an allergy person and I am suffering from this change of season. So I apologize if I'm hacking through this. Thank you, Parker. That was such a nice introduction. And all I have to say is go Bobcats and meow. We are so fierce in our tiny liberal arts college. So said, I work for Wetlands Watch. We are a nonprofit based in Norfolk, Virginia, working on conservation. And we're working where land, communities, and water meet to conserve nature in a changing climate. And so much of what Parker said about their work is at the intersection of land and water, and that is the name of the game in this issue. And the better we all work to understand what complicated what a complicated nexus this is, the better equipped we'll be to develop strong solutions and sound strategies moving forward. So I'm thrilled to be a part of the Conservation Games. I think it's a great initiative, and I look forward to talking with you all today about this work that we're doing and this incredible challenge of how we will deal with wetlands and wetlands loss in the face of sea level rise. Oops, got a hot mouse over here. Okay, so as I mentioned, I work for Wetlands Watch. We are working here. You can see a lot of the pictures are showing this intersection of land and water. We work a lot in promoting nature-based solutions to flooding, which you can see through this very nice living shoreline here on the bottom left. We are in a very, very serious impact situation in terms of flooding and sea level rise in Norfolk, Virginia, where our organization is based. You can see this in the top left picture. This is my neighborhood, and this is where I run with my dog right here. And we usually go like this along what is covered up, but is usually a path and a road right here. So the impacts are severe, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We also think a lot about who's responsible for maintaining infrastructure, and you can see this very clearly in the top right picture. This is a picture from Gloucester County. If you've ever been down to Guinea Neck, no one understands these risks and these impacts more than the people of Guinea Neck. And we do a lot with the community. We do a lot through citizen science and outreach, and we work a lot with partners. Just as Parker mentioned, that's our organization thrives based off of our partnerships, and we try to work within those partnerships in every chance we can. Our work is pretty unusual for an environmental nonprofit. We do a lot of wonky stuff in the local government space and advocacy space. We work in your city council, your town halls, your county boards of governance, and then we're working in Richmond and in DC too. So we kind of are hitting it from all angles and working at programs from lots of different perspectives, trying to do as much gap filling as possible and working on identifying solutions that are a little bit less known and trying to ground truth them in communities. There's a lot of work being done at a high level in our country related to climate change and sea level rise, and very few organizations are taking the time to test out strategies and solutions at the ground level, and we really feel like that's super important to do. Wetlands migration is definitely what we're talking about today, but I just want to note that just because we're talking about wetlands migration doesn't mean that all of these other elements of our program areas aren't impacted. Everything regarding flood risk and sea level rise is so interrelated and so multidisciplinary, and it affects every single sector of governance, of community, and of economics. And so I just can't stress how complicated this issue is. And, hopefully this presentation will show just a sliver of that. So sea level rise, the impacts are unstoppable, irrefutable. We're seeing aggressive change at an alarming pace. This is the actual increase in relative sea level rise. So this is what the tide gauges have actually collected in terms of data. And then this is what's projected to occur with your continued observed increase, and then different curves that indicate different levels of risk. Right now,
Carson,
we're...
sorry to interrupt you. I think you were trying to show with the cursor. I don't know if everybody can see your cursor. I was not able to see it. But if you want to just describe
Oh,
when
sure.
you're
Yes.
using that. Thank you.
Oh, okay, good. So no cursor lie. Okay, got it. All right, so we're on the purple line. That's the intermediate high. That's really what everybody can kind of expect to occur. So outlays are obviously seen on your screen, but you know, we're in a situation where we're looking at about 6 feet by 2100, which is alarming. And the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission in our region is a planning authority. There are PDCs everywhere across the state, and our PDC has taken it upon itself to help advise on planning scenarios based off of time. And so the gray boxes show a period of specific number of years, and then the associated sea level rise that people should anticipate for that gray period of time. So they're looking at this in terms of how long infrastructure intends to last, the lifespan of projects, and trying to break it down into a digestible period of time, as you know, which is generally correlative with planning horizons for various buildings, infrastructure, roads, bridges, etc. So the pace is accelerating. Okay, I hope that this is working for, okay, great. So with that sea level rise curve, this is what the region where we are working primarily in, or at least most geographically associated with, this is what the impacts look like. Anything that has any blue on it is inundated, and the risks are coming from all directions. So coming from the north with the James River, the Elizabeth River, and then coming down from the Outer Banks and the Pamlico Sound, excuse me, good Lord. So a lot of impacts and from all directions, which of course is not helpful. So why is this such a problem? Well, the built infrastructure that we have depended upon and that we do depend upon in our communities is really in the water's way. And this is due to a lot of reasons. We did a tremendous amount of filling in wetlands and draining swamps, and not in the good political way that people talk about, but in a real, tangible way. We took water away from where it should be, and we just filled our land with dirt, and we built buildings on top of it, thinking that that was an appropriate response to wetland. And now the water is returning, and we unfortunately haven't done a very good job of planning for that return. So it's a combination of filling in and living where, putting infrastructure where we shouldn't. And then it's really just a consequence of the times where the water is rising and there's nowhere for it to go. We don't have big pumps like New Orleans and like some of our major cities. We don't have a lot of the infrastructure and investment to get rid of the water in a engineered way. We're exploring a lot of those large structural flood reduction methods, but they cost a lot of money, and our communities really haven't budgeted for big expenses like that, and no communities have. You really need federal investment. So let's talk about the built infrastructure problem. What are the impacts of sea level rise to residential structures? So today we have over 73,000 residential structures. That correlates to about 43.6 billion in values that are at risk of coastal flooding. So that translates to about 4.9 billion in damages. And this is all for, our our coastal zone. And this is data coming from the state's recent, as of fall 2021, Coastal Resilience Master Plan. So that's today. What does it look like in 2080? We then have 246,000 residential structures, and that's an increase of 235% that are now at risk from coastal flooding, raising that 4.9 billion to 35.9 billion in damages. It's about 600, almost 650% increase. So residential structures, as you could clearly see from the previous slide, are certainly going to be greatly impacted by sea level rise. This is just showing what some of those inundated buildings, the increases look like over time from 2020 to 2080. And then overlaid on it, the brown is annualized losses. So purple houses, annualized losses are in brown. And as you're moving up the, or I guess down the purple gradient, so deep purple is just everyday high tide impacts. And then you go into the lighter purple and you're getting your extreme scenario flood events. So your 0.2% annual chance of flooding. And the call outs are really notable in this graphic. 150% increase in flood exposed residences between 2020 and 2080. So the more structures we build in our great migration to coastal communities, which has occurred over the past 50 years, the more at risk these communities will be. Let's talk about roadways. This is directly relevant for any community, and often there's a great disparity between ownership in our urban communities, cities and towns. Municipalities, counties are, they own a lot of the roadways, but as soon as you go into a more rural setting, the state owns the roadways, and there's a lot of dispute as to who's responsible for maintaining roads, and particularly who's responsible for maintaining them when they're inundated chronically and when access becomes an issue. So today, 1,650 miles impacted by major floods. And I just want to clarify, major flood in this instance is a 1% annual chance flood. And then you look at the time span between today and 2080, and you add 200% of miles that are impacted by a major flood. Chronic flooding. So today we have 500 miles that are impacted by chronic flooding. That means that you have flooding that's inundated, it's sort of like nuisance flooding, where it occurs a little bit more than, a little bit less than daily, but certainly more than just a couple times a year. So the flooding that I was showing you of Norfolk in the previous slides, that is flooding that we see probably 30 times a year. So we're now looking at about 30 to 40 days of nuisance flooding in Norfolk every year. So that's what I mean by chronic flooding. So today we have 500 miles that are impacted. And then looking at the time span between now and 2080, you're looking at an increase of 460% of chronic inundation. So major impacts to roadways. The document that I've referenced, I'll put in the chat a link to it. It is fascinating. Everybody should take a look. It includes wonderful graphics that illustrate what this impact actually looks like overlaid on a map of Virginia. And it's, of course, just the coastal zone. So I definitely would encourage everybody to check that out. This is a big heavy hitter. So by 2080, over 920 miles will be open water or underwater every time we get a daily high tide. So it's pretty dismal stuff, honestly. This is a graphic that shows the miles of roadways that are inundated during a flood event. Again, with the gradation here of orange, your tidal, your dark orange is daily high tide. So you can see it by 2080, we're almost at that 1,000. And so that was the previous slide, said about 980 miles. That's daily inundation. Chronic is again, your nuisance flooding, and then the extreme is the lightest color, orange. And so, we're really looking at almost 6,000 miles of roadways at risk from extreme flooding in 2080. So the outlook is, again, a little grim. Hopefully we're going to have some positive stuff happening in this presentation too, I promise. So we talked about the built infrastructure problem. Now the reason why we're all here, we're going to talk about the natural infrastructure problem. So just like there were structures in harm's way, well, we also have structures in nature's way. So we're thinking a lot, and Parker mentioned this, about how to address this issue of our natural features existing wonderfully here along the landscape. And fringe marshes do a tremendous job at a lot of different benefits that we're going to talk about, but certainly providing a great water quality benefit in the picture on the right, providing wonderful buffer. But unfortunately, there's nowhere for this buffer to go into the landscape because it will come up against a house. So we're thinking quite a lot about what we do with this intersection of water and land and property. So unfortunately, wetlands accretion rates in Virginia are outpaced by sea level rise. And so in order for wetlands to continue to thrive and exist, they would need to grow or accrete vertically. That's typically how our wetlands grow and thrive. But the vertical growth rate is less than sea level rises rate. And so the only way for wetlands to survive, unfortunately, tidal wetlands in Virginia, is for them to grow horizontally into the landscape. So this is the problem here. There's nowhere for our wetlands to go but landward. And we obviously are going to have big issues with infrastructure stopping that growth from occurring. All right, so we're going to talk about tidal wetlands loss in Virginia. Right now, we have 190,000 acres of tidal wetlands. And unfortunately, the outlook is not good for sea level rise losses. 2040, we're looking at 19% loss, 2060, 49% loss, and 2080, a whopping, staggering, devastating 89% loss. Now, it's important to note that there are some variability in wetlands models. In December of 2020, VIMS projected that wetlands loss of up to 50% by 2100, but they were imagining that the wetlands were going to migrate into the landscape pretty much at pace with sea level rise. So best outlook for migration, and we get 50%. They also are accounting for some areas to gain marshes in the tidal freshwater and upriver. So 2021 in November, the Coastal Master Plan, which is what I was just referencing, is projecting that really scary 89% loss. And they did not account for any migration of marshes. That was not assumed in the model. And finally, June 2022, Climate Central, which is a nonprofit based in Princeton, New Jersey, they released a study that projects wetland loss of 42%. Now, just like the VIMS study, they did project for some wetlands migration to occur. So I just included this not to confuse anybody, but to offer, some positive outlook for whatever it's worth. 50% of loss is still pretty horrific, but if we do account for migration, the losses will be less. And in the event that people have seen a lot of this, the news sources or some of the coverage on this issue, the Climate Central study has really been covered pretty well by national media. People don't really care about wetlands losses, and we're definitely going to talk about that a little bit. Upland habitat, so in a lot of the freshwater areas, and certainly some of the areas where a lot of the folks on this call might be living in, or where conservation might be occurring, there's a little bit of a better news for these areas. So at Currently, right now, there are 140,000 acres of non-tidal wetlands, and the losses are a little bit, less steep for 2080, about 51%. And then currently we have 148,000 acres of woodland or shrub scrub habitat. And the losses from this habitat are even better in terms of impacts. So not quite as many losses in the more upland habitat. And this is certainly true because there's going to be a little bit better slope for some of those wetlands to be protected. So the impacts are devastating for natural infrastructure, just like built infrastructure. So impacts are really scary. But there's a big problem with who's advocating for the built infrastructure versus the natural infrastructure. So property owners and governments, they're speaking up for their impacts, their structures, their roads. But what we are really concerned about is who's speaking for nature's impacts. Where is our LORAC speaking for the trees? We don't really have a good advocate for these natural features to be factored in to major decision making that is occurring at the state level and at the local level and at the regional level. So we really are encouraging everybody in our universe, which now includes y'all, to think of natural infrastructure as critical infrastructure. And, I feel as though I'm kind of speaking to the choir here because you all, given your interests, clearly understand what an incredible value wetlands are providing to our state, to our region, and to your community. So very quickly, food, habitat, predator refuge, over 90% of recreational catch, finfish and shellfish are depending on wetlands for at least some part of their life cycle. And this is 75% the case for commercial catch. For our economy, Virginia is getting an incredible almost $1 billion in annual revenue from fishing, jobs, revenue from local and state taxes. For water quality benefits, the nutrient, pollution, and sediment removal values that wetlands are playing are really important to bay health. They're important to your local water health as well. Wetlands provide a great recharge in our upland areas, and they provide shore stabilization. That's really important. They are protecting against flood damage by storing some rainwater and floodwater. They're not a silver bullet. We're going to talk a little bit about that. They are absorbing wave energy, which is really important along our coastal region. And there's this great statistic where about almost 250 acres of wetlands is providing 1.8 million in storm protection. They are collecting, they're storing carbon through sequestration 5 times more effectively than rainforests. Obviously, the aesthetics are known to everybody. It's really, really important that everybody drink the Kool-Aid on how important the fringe wetlands are, as well as living shorelines. So even this tiny wetlands in an urban setting, this is from the Hermitage Garden, Museum and Gardens, is incredible, the value that these small fringe marshes are providing. All you need is 10 feet along the shoreline to protect or to provide water quality benefits, 10 feet within the actual 10 feet of width to do carbon sequestration, and then 10 feet along the frontage of the property as far as connected to the land to provide an erosion protection. So this is all you need to get incredible value out of your fringe marshes. And what is really, really important and what is standing in the way of our ability for our tidal fringe marshes and living shorelines to thrive are structures. Wetlands can only migrate when there's a good slope, a slope that is favorable to migration. And if the slope is good and there's something in the way, then it doesn't matter. This is, it's a drowned wetland. The loss is there. So it's just critical that we figure out how to deal with providing some protection against prohibitions of migration. There are a lot of shoreline regulations that are responsible for decision making along our shorelines in Virginia. The wetlands are, of course, regulated by the Tidal Wetlands Act, but right next to the wetlands, the future wetlands is regulated by the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, and the 100-foot or maybe more, but often the case less in our urban areas. These buffers have the ability to be natural migration pathways for our existing wetlands in the face of sea level rise. But these are really static regulations. And now we have climate change in our Chesapeake Bay Act, and we have climate change in our wetlands regulation, but there's a lot of uncertainty as to how decision makers are actually going to implement this climate consideration that's been included in these regulations. There's still no real assurity that what happens along our shoreline will actually survive in the face of sea level rise. And of course, what happens in the private land and the unregulated landscape is in question and is a real unknown. So what do we do about wetlands migration? How do we do it? In an urban context, we need to be thinking about small scale. We need to be thinking about fringe marshes. We need to prioritize marshes and the migration of marshes when there is favorable slope. And then we need to think a lot about acquisition of structures to make sure that our shorelines can move. And the acquisition of structures should definitely be based on where it's not safe for people to live. That should be the real nexus between structure removal and wetlands migration. But it's really important that we all have open eyes, because wetlands are going to lose out against the built infrastructure every single time because of the way that federal programs have their benefit cost analysis built in, and the way that people feel about wetlands, and of course the way people feel about their homes and private property rights. For rural migration, we really have to prioritize very large scale protection efforts. We have to remove those physical barriers for migration. And then, this is the perfect audience, we have to work within conserved lands and strengthen the protections that are already written into a lot of our conservation instruments. Wetlands migration planning is underway. Maryland is looking at where they can do these, where they can prioritize these marsh migration corridors. And that's work that we hope to replicate in Virginia. And I hope that I get to partner with Parker and with you all on all that work moving forward. So that's an overview. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to our next discussion.
Thanks,
Mary-Carson.
Oh, yeah, Parker, you take it away.
I was gonna jump in or no, Peter, you got your slides. Why don't you go, and then we'll get to the other portion.
Sure. Share my screen. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Good, thank you. All right. So for the next part of our discussion, Parker and Mary-Carson are going to demo some of the ways that we can actually map these coastal flood hazards across the region. As Mary-Carson mentioned, our protected lands, our conservation areas, are one of those areas that we can actually do something very meaningful and impactful to allow for this marsh migration. And Capital Region Land Conservancy holds easements and owns land that will be impacted by by coastal flooding and sea level rise along our tidal rivers in Virginia. And there are three really great tools that can help you visualize some of these impacts, and we're gonna walk through, I think, two of them today. I have some maps to share from the Virginia Coastal Resilience Web Explorer 1.0. That's a tool that came from the state, from the new Coastal Resilience Master Plan. It's a great tool. I'd recommend checking it out later. And then Parker is going to show us a little demo of the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer. And then another great tool is the VIMS Adapt VA, which Mary-Carson could probably answer questions about that tool later on as well. Three of the conservation areas that we are going to talk about are right here in the Capital Region, in Chesterfield and Henrico County specifically. You can see the three areas highlighted in yellow. I don't know if you can actually see my cursor, but in the top, let's use geographic terms. In the northwest corner, you can see the Cedar Crest easement. In the south of the James River, you can see the River's Bend easement, and northeast of the river, at Deep Bottom, you can see the Varina Land Lab. And this is the coastal flood hazard for 2020. And I'm just going to switch maybe back and forth real quick. So 2020 versus 2080. If I go back to 2020 real quick, you can see that most of this area, the main channel of the river, is in the darkest color. That's the mean low water. So that's just the average water level. And then some of the surrounding areas are this darker blue, which shows that they might be flooded once every 5 years. It's a 5-year storm scenario. By 2080, a lot of those areas will be completely inundated on a day-to-day basis. And let's dive in on one of those areas specifically. I might just do one for the sake of time, but the Cedar Crest easement, this is an area of farmland along the James River. And in 2020, it's showing that much of this area will not be disturbed. It might be flooded once every 5 years in part of the area, but in general, it won't be impacted on a year-to-year basis. And in 2080, almost half of that area, maybe 40% of that area, will either be inundated daily, or that area will be flooded every several years, making it very difficult to farm in that area. And some of this upland area, the area that won't be impacted, if that's graded correctly, it could allow for marsh migration upslope, as Mary-Carson mentioned. And then you can see sort of a similar situation with the River's Bend easement and with the Varina Land Lab as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Parker to demo our next model. I don't know, Parker, you had any other comments about the Varina Land Lab before that?
No, not before we get into this, but I will say, so the Cedar Crest easement we did some time ago, and we were already beginning to see in some of the modeling how marsh migration came into play. And it was, it became something that we really thought more meticulously about, because it used to be, well, you'd set up this kind of buffer based on the survey of the property. Well, let's say that the survey of the property starts changing because of land accretion, or in this case, you're losing your land, and therefore, you know, what's going to happen to that? And people started to say, well, you need to have a buffer that is going to move with the boundaries of the property. So it did become something that we were more mindful of. And now all of a sudden we have even more models. And so one of the things that Mary-Carson and I talked about that we thought might be helpful for you all in this is to kind of bring this home to the Richmond region and look at, we're going to probably focus just on the National Oceanographic and Aeronautic Association so that we can look really at one model in depth. But I will just share, as Peter mentioned, and what Mary-Carson was describing, there is the Virginia Coastal Resiliency Web Mapper Explorer. So you can go in here. This is tied to that resiliency master plan, and it has different scenarios, and you can go in and see what's going to happen to the upland and what's going to happen to the tidal habitat, et cetera. And then also with the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, again, they have mapped a lot of these natural resources, and then the ability to go back in and see what happens with the sea level rise modeling and what would ultimately happen to those natural resources. But we're going to focus here on the NOAA model, the sea level rise viewer, and this came out earlier this year, and it's a pretty interesting viewer, largely from the sense that the other viewers, and similar to the way that Mary-Carson was presenting, look at these models based on what is the likely probability of having a high threat or the highest of threats or low medium threat. And then you run out these different timeline scenarios from 2020 to 2040 to 2060 to 2080. This one's a little bit different, and it's probably in some ways a little bit more useful of a tool because we really can't predict, well, by 2040, this is going to be the amount of sea level rise. It's very hard to say with 100% accuracy as that can change. We know it's increasing. We just don't know if we're going to hit that 1 foot mark by 2040, or if that's going to be coming at 2035, or if that's going to happen at 2045. But instead, the NOAA model is looking at it differently from well, regardless of the timeline, what happens if the sea level reaches this height? And Mary-Carson, I don't know if you want to say anything before we get into this about either the other two that we just skimmed through, or about the difference with the NOAA model and its utility. And simply put, this is where citizen scientists can also come in handy, because this is all available and we'll all be able to start putting in data that I think can ultimately help inform the models. But MC, do you have anything you want to add at this time?
I put links to every single thing in the chat. And so if y'all want to go to any of the models that Parker's just been walking through, you can do so that way. And I would just say that the both of the other viewers are using NOAA data, and the Adapt Virginia just refines that data a little bit more to be Virginia specific. And then the state resource, the Virginia Coastal Resilience Web Explorer, is pulling data from NOAA resources as well as their own models. That was a Dewberry contract. So NOAA is sort of like the birthplace of all the data, and this is the most user-friendly for the average person, I would say. And I would consider myself in that category too. I like it the best.
Well, and it certainly is visual, but all of these are going to have their own little differences of how you navigate through them. They really are going to all give you that sea level rise. Some of them might give you a little bit more data on, well, what's going to be the impact on our local fire stations or our other built infrastructure, as Mary-Carson was describing. Some might look more at the demographic data and say, well, what about our most vulnerable populations and where are they located and what's going to be the impact on the human element? So you can explore them on your own and learn quite a bit, but it's important for us in our region to recognize that, yes, Richmond is on the fall line, Petersburg is on the fall line. That means that really half of our region is coastal. And it's not beachfront coastal, it's not Atlantic Ocean coastal, but it is still coastal in the sense that it is tidal and it is coming in with the salinity of ocean waters coming in. And that's something that we didn't quite get into too much with Mary-Carson's presentation, but at least with this NOAA model, you will begin to see why that is important, because as the sea level rises in an inland area where we have significant fresh water meeting in with the the brackish water, you end up with different type of marshes. Well, if we change the salinity, you're going to change the type of natural community that can exist in there. So it is both can it migrate fast enough, but in this instance, can it adapt to a different salinity rate? And that may be a whole nother issue for us in our region. But I pulled up on my screen just to give you a sense, looking back into kind of the eastern Henrico Varina area. And I don't know, can you all see my cursor? If I'm moving it around?
Yes.
Okay, so my cursor right now is down around Curl's Neck. Curl's Neck is about 4,000 acres right in here. Malvern Hill is just over here. We have Presqu'Île National Wildlife Refuge and Turkey Island down here. The deep bottom area that we've been talking about is the Varina Land Lab up here. And then I don't know why I can't get this big old thing out of my way, but I'll just scroll over. You get Rivers Bend. This is the Dutch Gap area. And where Peter was mentioning Cedar Crest is just over here. So one of the things with the NOAA model, and I'll just share, so you've got the purple and the green, and those are pretty much what we have selected to show as the marshes here. We have wetlands in green, and we have the marshes in purple. All of that works together as kind of your natural infrastructure down and around the coast. And the wetlands are serving just as much protection as the marshes. They have different ecotypes, and that hence NOAA has differentiated between the two. But what you can begin to see, and over here on the left is your column where you can change the sea level. And unlike the other models where you can play God by changing the timeline and see what happens over time, this is allowing you to play God in how much sea level rises. And, you know, the worst case scenario that they have here is a 10-foot sea level rise. And I can tell you that that would be pretty darn devastating for a lot. But even on just a small scale, there is a significant impact based on our wetlands in our region. So I'm going to move this, and maybe we can, at this point, get a little bit of interaction. But what do you think is a likelihood of losing marshes in our region with, say, a 1 foot sea level rise? Is that seem to be what we should be worried about? Or are we really looking at a 3 foot or 6 foot sea level rise when we're becoming very concerned about what may be happening in the future? Any ideas? Anybody want to add into the chat what they think happens at different levels? Or Peter showed you all some examples earlier in terms of 2020 to 2080. But what does that look like, and how much sea level did that entail? I think Mary-Carson was giving us some data about what percentages of marshes are expected to be overcome during that period. And I can't see the chat by sharing my screen. So if anybody can see the chat, Peter, if you want, we have any comments? Too much. I like that one. Thank you, Roseanne. Well, here, I'm going to get back here and I will just show you all what happens. Maybe you've already gone to this portion. So if I just tick this up at 1/2 foot, you see what happened? I'm going to go back down. Take a look at Presqu'île National Wildlife Refuge. That's just at 1/2 foot, 6 inches. And you see what happens to the green there, which is really those freshwater wetlands and the type of more upland habitat. And they become now part of your tidal marshes. So they're no longer serving your wetlands in that regard. They're becoming the tidal aspect, because with 6 inches change, it has pretty much come in and affected Presqu'île in a pretty intense way. And if you look at Curl's Neck, you'll see something very similar. But what you see at Curl's Neck is that it went not to purple, but to this teal color. And the thing in the teal that is maybe not so helpful here, and I apologize, the NOAA website, I can't really find a very useful legend without having to like navigate out to their help to then show you this. But the teal here is where it has gone from your wetlands to your marshes to now inundation. So this is showing what happens to Curl's Neck with just 6 inches of higher sea level, is pretty much that whole lower third is becoming inundated and not supporting your marshes. And if we go to 1 foot, you see again how Curl's Neck, even more of it is inundated. And if you get to 1.5 feet, you begin to see what happens to some of the other areas, particularly in and around Dutch Gap. And where you really see things go dramatic is right at about 3.5 feet. Everything at Curl's Neck is underwater. Everything at Presqu'île is now basically inundated. And even up here at 4 Mile Creek, where we have the Varina Land Lab, we're talking about 100 or more acres of wetlands up there that now become inundated. All of the deep bottom, the Rivers Bend area, and then pretty much everything down here around Dutch Gap. And all you got to do is run the model a little bit more, and you can see how we're just creating islands. And coming back up to where Cedar Crest is, if I zoom in a little bit there, you will see Cedar Crest is essentially leaving a few islands that are left out here that are detached from the mainland. And that's going to be where things really begin to not just show the fragmentation of what's happening with the sea level rise, but also where there's no more room for the marshes to migrate. And I'm going to come back over here just to kind of keep focused in on deep bottom. And you can see just how much is going to be underwater here at a 5 foot sea level rise. And you can see just how steep there is no transition, right? You have open water to these bluffs, and the bluffs are beautiful. They're fantastic ridges, but with this, we're no longer going to have these bluffs overlooking these marshes. We're going to have them overlooking open waters, because the topography, and as Mary-Carson was saying, the slope, there is no slope here for the migration to occur, and certainly not to occur under the timeline that it has to move, assuming that there might be some erosion effect of this, where uplands begin to to be eroded into the lowland. So we really have to start thinking about this. And as localities are thinking about protecting the built infrastructure, we're having to think too about how do you protect the natural infrastructure. This whole area with Curls Neck and Presqu'île and Deep Bottom and Jones Neck, this is all part of an Audubon Society important birding area because it's one of the main stopover points for migratory birds. And we've got faculty who are tagging the birds to track the migration patterns. Well, if they lose that habitat, they may not be stopping over here on their migration. And if they don't have sufficient stopover places, what's going to happen to that migratory bird species? These are all the interconnected problems that we have to think about as we look at sea level rise. And really, you know, you can use these maps and go just about anywhere in the region to assess the impact, whether it's on the James River or on the Appomattox River or the Chickahominy River or the Pamunkey River. Up on the Pamunkey River, near the Pamunkey Indian Reservation and Cumberland Marsh area, huge loss of habitat from sea level that is projected up there. And the Chickahominy will suffer just as greatly. And so the question then becomes is, can we be targeting and protecting land around these rivers and around these marshes so that if there are areas for good slope and migration, that there is a viable path forward for the habitat to move. And that's something that I think by looking at these models and having these tools available to us, we can begin to assess not just, oh, it's good to work along our streams and our rivers because there's opportunities for buffer for water quality, but now there's the opportunity for buffer for migration of the natural infrastructure.
Hey, Parker.
So, yes.
Sorry to rush, but I would love there to be a little bit of time for questions. And there are two questions in the chat that might help us center the last couple minutes of the discussion. Would you like me to read those aloud?
That would be great. Thank you.
Sure.
And what I might do is stop presenting.
So Becky Lakin asked, what can we do as residents who live around these areas set to be most compromised? Are there prevention and adaptation strategies we should start to consider and implement? And also noting that there are areas around the perimeter of the river that have many spots owned by Henrico County that need active care, ways to influence the county to do more for these areas. So actions for individuals that live around these areas and then ways to advocate, maybe.
So I think that's a great question, Becky. And, you know, I can say every resident has a place to do something. I grew up in Virginia Beach and my parents, we were on the water. My dad actually grew up on an island that had a causeway that flooded at high tide. So the only way on and off the island was to wait for the tide to recede. But for us, we put in what we thought 20 years ago was a living shoreline. It was before anybody really knew all these things. And for down there, they were having issues with compaction as well as sea level rise. But you know, everybody can do something. And even if you don't live on the water, there are things that we can be thinking about that would help with some of the habitat. There are a lot of folks, you know, when you're looking at Charles City, Curls Neck, you know, they did a lot of sand and gravel mining out there. And a lot of these old sand and gravel pits are being restored into wetlands and to provide for habitat. They're not tidal, but they are at least trying to help create new wetland habitat along the coastal line that can be supportive. You know, Mary-Carson might have some other ideas, but like I said, finding those properties that we can go ahead and protect in anticipation of the migration is important for our work. But I think on the individual level, MC, you all have some other programs down in Norfolk. I know particularly they changed some of their zoning ordinances.
Yeah, I mean, I think that and this is sort of related to the question that Eileen also asked. She asked if there had been a presentation to the City Council for Richmond or Henrico County official groups, Charles City, et cetera. And I really think that so much of this comes down to awareness building and generating interest in the topic. This is pretty, I mean, it's not new because we've known about the wetlands losses that were coming, but to have the tools and the models to really show it in a meaningful way is somewhat new. There are a lot of issues around who can actually do the conservation and through what instruments. And so for local governments, it's a capacity issue and it's a funding issue. So if Henrico County, for instance, all of a sudden said, okay, well, we really need to protect these wetlands and protect the land behind them so they can migrate and survive and all that, then they would have to have significant resources to either purchase the property and conserve it, or work with an entity to actually accomplish that work. So if it's owned already by the county, that's an ideal situation. But even then, the government might not be interested in conserving it or managing the land to ensure that it isn't developed if conservation isn't an option. So I think that what we're trying to accomplish is helping introduce local government staff in local governments where knowledge on this issue is limited, introduce them to conservation practices, introduce them to organizations, like this one that y'all are all involved in, to say, there are conservation groups that can help get you to your goal of conserving land for wetlands migration. But honestly, this is all pretty new. Maryland is leading the charge nationally in the creation of marsh migration corridors. We want to replicate their work in Virginia, and we're just kind of getting our feet wet in this space and trying to understand how to make it happen. So it's a little bit early, and we hope it's not too late, quite frankly.
And I think to Aileen's question about getting in front of the local governments, they, I think, are aware of the issue. I don't know how keenly focused they are on addressing the issue. They've got a lot of priorities, so they often will think about what is the most short-term immediate issue that they need to, what's the fire to put out today? That's the way the local governments usually run. And they're not looking at these very long time horizons that require a long time strategy. And that's unfortunate. Henrico County, however, and I think for those of you that were on, I think it was the Route 5 Corridor Coalition meeting, Aileen, or it was the HCAN meeting, I can't remember which one, but the representative said that the county was looking at acquiring flood-prone properties and that they had a grant from the Community Flood Preparedness Fund to study this, and that they were going to begin implementing it. They had money in their budget to begin acquiring some properties, but what they have been looking at is more or less the properties from stormwater flooding and not so much the kind of properties that could be flooded from sea level rise, that therefore could be part of a strategy for marsh migration. And that's where it can be informative to advise the county about this both and strategy, both the stormwater fresh stormwater
Wow, he
that's
wants
coming
to,
in.
wants to go
but
back in
also
the
do-
jar pretty fast, I'll tell you that. You're doing 5.
So, what other questions do we have? I bet this was a big eye opener for some people because I even know on our staff here, when we talked about coastal resilience, you know, sometimes our brain is thinking beach, coastal beach. You got to be down at the ocean front. And this is going to affect anywhere that is tidal. And it is interesting though, because with the falls being here, you can go right to the fall line in downtown Richmond and you can see where the migration, the sea level rise impact stops. It just abruptly stops because of the elevation change.
Parker, somebody wants CRLC to conserve shorelines through a campaign to targeted homeowners like her, Becky.
Yeah,
She's offering. She said little property, but if you are chunking it all together.
that's right. I do know. And that's exactly what you all have had to try to do down in Norfolk.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about Norfolk is that their zoning ordinance, they now require the developers to pay into it. So if you're going to develop land, you need to start paying in to help compensate the landowners who need to be bought out from these flood prone areas. And that land is now, I think they've worked it out now where the Living River Trust is, I think, being the easement holder.
Yeah, that's the goal. There are innovative zoning practices to do a lot of this flood reduction work through conservation. City of Norfolk is exploring it, and we're working on implementing their exploration. It's very complicated, but it's sort of like a transfer of development rights program, which is very common for density desired transfers across the country. People use that as a zoning tool. It's a form of downzoning, but it has a nice conservation mix. And in the Keys, they're looking at this as kind of like a density transfer for them. It's all about the ability to get people out of harm's way during a hurricane evacuation. And so they're just trying to keep people from building on open lots, but it's the Keys. And so every open lot is essentially going underwater in the future. And so they didn't intend to reduce development rights in their kind of sea level rise risk area, but that is in effect what's happening. And that's another version of how you can use zoning in a very innovative and adaptive way.
That's right at the local level. Well, Peter, do you see any other questions?
I think that's all the questions we have for now. And folks can stay after to ask some additional questions if they like. Just want to share my screen one last time and then I'll let everybody go. If you need to head out now, that's okay too. But just a reminder, well, first of all, thank you so much, Mary-Carson, for your presentation. I learned a lot. It was eye-opening for me as well. So thank you very, very much. And we are looking forward to these river-specific, these tidal river-specific conservation campaigns. If you are looking to get involved more with the conservation games, or if you've already signed up, we have a garden cleanup this Saturday at 10 a.m. And I just wanted to put that reminder out there. If you're signed up, you will get the details from me later this week. On Sunday, we have our Fields, Forests, and Streams celebration. This is going to be down in Petersburg at the VSU Appomattox River Overlook. We're going to have live music, food and drinks, and we're going to have a guided nature walk at our brand new 42-acre riverfront protected property. It'll be complete with trails in the future, and it's has some really interesting history. So if you're interested in learning more about that or just celebrating with us, please come join us. and you can sign up for that with the regular Conservation Games registration link. I just wanted to say thank you to our sponsor for tonight's event, and for the Team Streams official sponsor, Resource Environmental Solutions, or RES. We've done a lot of great work with them, including mapping some of our riverfront properties, and they're a great supporter. And thank you to all of our other sponsors. Team Forest is sponsored by Davie Mitigation. Team Fields is sponsored by Ingle Family Farms. And of course, we want to say thank you for all of our other sponsors: Historic Tuckahoe, Leasefield Contractor, Virginia State University, Colonial Farm Credit, Primus Bank, Luckstone, Canal Capital Management, the Virginia Outdoors Foundation, and Camp Holly Springs. And I hope this isn't blocking one more, but and again, thank you very much for attending tonight. Go whatever team you are on, go Team Fields, go Team Forest, go Team Streams, and thank you all for your participation. Looking forward to meeting you all at our other events.
Thanks again, MC.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate
Absolutely.
it.
Stays on for questions.
Thank you.
Well, we'll be in touch. And I did think of one thing, and Becky's probably gone, but we are having on October 26th a workshop for landowners in Petersburg, where we specifically targeted the landowners along the Appomattox River to talk to them about conservation easements. So, you know, there are strategies to begin the conversation, and it takes many years to build up that kind of awareness. And, you know, eventually we'll get the landowners interested and hopefully protecting their land before it's too late.
Is that information out there, Parker?
Yeah,
That we
it
can
was.
share?
Yeah, we can put it in another e-newsletter, but Peter, if you can grab the FOLAR, the registration is being done through the Friends of the Lower Appomattox River.
Okay.
And so we can share that, but it's October 26th at 6 p.m. At the Petersburg Library.
Okay.
And Jane Myers will be there for CRLC, and we'll be talking to some different opportunities.
Okay. We'll share the information. Thanks. That was
Yeah.
great.
Thank you.
Good night.